Hello and welcome to The Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday, March 17th. I'm Cindy Yu, the Spectator's broadcast editor, and your host this week. On the show, Boris Johnson is in the Gulf, trying to persuade Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to release more oil supplies and ease the global energy crisis. Will they? I'll speak to James Forsyth and Katy and the former American diplomat David Rundell. Delegations from Russia and Ukraine are meeting again to try and negotiate a peace deal. What more should the West be doing to support President Zelensky? The historian Timothy Garton Ash will be on the show. Kate Andrews also writes in this week's issue, fact-checking Western politicians' claims that our cost of living crisis is down to the Russian invasion. Kate will be on to argue why the war shouldn't be a cop-out for governments. And finally, what links our royal family to the Romanovs, the family that ruled Russia for over 3 centuries? The royal biographer Robert Hardman joins the show. Before we get going, a very special thank you to Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management, who are sponsoring The Week in 60 Minutes. Canaccord are experienced wealth planners and investment managers who go above and beyond to offer you support and guidance. Just visit candowealth.com to find out more. And remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel too. Click the red subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. Boris Johnson is this week meeting with the rulers of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, asking them to pump more oil to ease the West's energy crisis. But has he already failed? I'm joined now by James Forsyth, the Spectator's political editor, and Katy, our deputy political editor. Also joining the show is David Rundell, former American diplomat and author of Vision or Mirage, Saudi Arabia at the Crossroads. Now, Katy, despite much controversy surrounding this visit that Boris Johnson has made to the Gulf states, it doesn't seem to have yielded much result. So do you think the visit has been a flop this week?
I mean, I think it depends what we judge on. Was there an announcement immediately saying, yes, the Saudis are pumping more oil and it's going to help in the UK in terms of cost of living? No. Instead, we got a statement after it, which is saying they agreed to keep working on strategies to work together on energy. So it doesn't feel as though there's a quick win here. But we're also not hearing that the trip was a disaster. So I think that if you're looking at, I suppose, building up that relationship so you can get to the point where you get to the end goal, in a few months' time, perhaps there is some progress there. But in terms of something Boris Johnson can come back and shout about, not so much.
And David, the British PM said that it was within Saudi Arabia's interest to help the West, but it doesn't seem like Mohammed bin Salman necessarily agrees with that. Why is Saudi Arabia reluctant on this front?
Well, Saudi Arabia is reluctant at the moment to break the agreement that OPEC Plus has laboriously created. This was not a small achievement. Getting OPEC members to agree, and more importantly, getting Russia to join in with this agreement was a major achievement for the Saudis and for Mohammed bin Salman himself. And they're not likely to throw that out the window quickly or easily, because it would be particularly difficult to resurrect in light of what's going on with Russia now, that if they are seen to be unreliable partners in OPEC, I think the Russians would be very reluctant to join with them in the future.
Can you talk a little bit more about this deal for viewers who don't know about it? What does it say? What does it do? Why are the Russians involved?
Okay. I think to back up just a moment and explain that Saudi Arabia is the only country in the world that maintains a large buffer stock or excess capacity of oil production. Most days, the Saudis have about 2 million barrels of spare production that they can turn on and turn off. This is a political decision, not a commercial decision. BP or Exxon would never drill wells that cost literally billions of dollars and then just shut them down and hope that they might need them on a rainy day. The Saudis do that, and when there is a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico that shuts down production, or there is an invasion of Kuwait that shuts down production, or there's a strike amongst the oil workers in Nigeria or Venezuela, or quite frankly, when the United States and its allies decide that we're going to put sanctions on Iran and stop them from exporting oil, who steps in to fill the gap so that there's not a big spike in the price? This is the Saudis. The second thing to know is, why do they do this? And the answer is because they have a great deal of oil. They want oil to remain part of the global energy mix for a long time. And they realize that if the price of oil gets too high, people will find alternatives or put the third set of insulation in their house or something that to reduce demand, or they'll start drilling in some very expensive place like the North Sea or Alaska. So they don't want the price to get too high, and they don't want, second thing it could do is if it gets too high, it drives the global economy into a recession, and then that also destroys demand. And finally, they don't want the price to be too volatile, because if the price is wildly unpredictable, people will have to, again, find an alternative. So for all those reasons, they try to keep the price at an affordable and reasonably stable price. They can't control the market, but they can influence it. And they do that by, on a monthly basis, adjusting how much they pump. So that's the background. The agreement that they negotiated with the Russians was basically, for the last couple of years, they have brought Russia into an informal, actually it's becoming more formal, agreement that while they're not officially a member of OPEC, they go along with the OPEC quotas. Mm-hmm. And the agreement they have had now for over a year is that they're going to increase production. First of all, you have to remember that they were asked by President Trump when the oil price was crashing to actually reduce their production to keep the price up. So, everyone goes to the Saudis. Some days they want them to increase, some days they want them to decrease. But in any event, when the price collapsed during COVID, production went down. Now it's going back up as people recover from COVID, and the agreement was that it would go up by 400,000 barrels every month. And they have been sticking to that agreement, and I think that they will continue to stick to that agreement. So they are actually increasing the amount that they produce at a set amount every month, as they believe we're recovering from COVID. What they were unwilling to do was to break their agreement and pump more quickly. Mm-hmm. So I hope that answered your question.
It does. Thank you, David. And James, from the British perspective then, how important is securing the support of the Gulf states like Saudi Arabia in tackling the Western cost of living crisis that's coming down the line?
So it is clearly important in terms of the resilience of the Western coalition against Russia on Ukraine and maintaining public support for sanctions. Now, I think there has been a US strategic miscalculation here, which is, as the US became more and more energy independent, the US thought it could get away from all the difficulties of and the moral complexities of a relationship with the House of Saud. The Biden administration called Saudi Arabia a pariah during the campaign. After he was elected, Joe Biden released a US intelligence assessment blaming Mohammed bin Salman for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, a Washington Post columnist. And I think the US thought that they didn't need this relationship with Saudi Arabia now because shale was making the US so much more energy independent. What I think the US failed to realize is that because it sits at the apex of two alliance structures in Europe and Asia, what matters is how energy independent the rest of the alliance is. And it's turned out that the rest of the alliance is nowhere near as energy independent as the US is, so Saudi Arabia is still very important. I think Mohammed bin Salman now might be in danger of making a strategic miscalculation himself, which is, I think he is clearly enjoying the fact that the Biden administration, which has refused to deal with him so far, is now going to have to deal with him. Boris Johnson, having cancelled 2 previous trips to Saudi Arabia, has flown out to see him this week. But I think the danger is if it looks like Saudi Arabia is not going to help by pumping more oil, Saudi Arabia will lose its place as the West's indispensable interlocutor on the oil market. And what you will see is the West saying, right, let's come to a quick deal with Iran in the nuclear negotiations in Vienna so we can get rid of sanctions on Iranian oil and get that back into the world market, which will deal with, reduce the leverage that Vladimir Putin has. Now, I mean, the irony here is that one of the reasons, the Saudis are, for understandable reasons, very unhappy about the fact that they feel that too many concessions are being made to Tehran in these negotiations already. But if Saudi Arabia does not indicate that it is prepared to help, I think the West will be more inclined to cut a quick deal with Iran rather than go through kind of 5 visits to Saudi Arabia to try and persuade them to help. I think Mohammed bin Salman has an opportunity here and he is in danger of missing it.
Well, David, what do you make of that? Because at the moment, the juncture that we're at the moment, it does seem like countries that are non-aligned, like China, India, Saudi Arabia, are having a lot of pressure put on them to be more leaning towards the West. So it's an incredibly sensitive moment, isn't it?
Well, I think that the comment was completely correct, that the idea that the Americans were energy independent was nonsense, because clearly oil is traded on a global market and the price is set globally, and our allies and trading partners are heavily dependent on imported oil. Even if we're not, we have to buy at a global price, and we have to hope that we want our allies to prosper. So that was the idea that we didn't need Saudi Arabia was a foolish idea to begin with. And I think, again, that it's also true that in the end, I would agree with that. I'm not sure that the Saudis see it that way. I don't think they're going to break their agreement with OPEC. I think they see that as a long-term commitment that would be very difficult to resurrect if they break it now. So I don't think they're going to break it. I could be wrong. And I think they do run a risk then of bringing Iran back into the market. The question is how quickly Iran can come back into the market and how much it can really add that it's not already selling under the table, so to speak, to some people like China, for example. So I don't know how much that's going to really solve things, but I do think that speaker is correct, that there is a danger that I would add to that, though, that the Biden administration wants to do a deal and is almost desperate to get that deal, and would have been desperate to get that deal regardless of the price of oil.
And Katy, just going back to the British side of things, Keir Starmer, I alluded to earlier, has been criticising the government for making a trip like this. But does Labour have an alternative for solving this kind of problem?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, because you have a situation where Keir Starmer has been very supportive of the government's response in terms of Russia's decision to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and has actually said, we're holding off on calling for the Prime Minister to go now. Now's not the time. And generally is pretty aligned when it comes to comments on NATO, when it comes to, just sending defensive weaponry, all those things. And on sanctions, yet we start to see the rub this week. You also had Angela Rayner, the deputy leader, questioning really why you would get into conversations with Saudi Arabia. As ever with Labour, when you try and press down on their exact position, which is, would you not have a relationship? Would you refuse to, use oil from Saudi? It becomes less clear. I think there's a little bit of a grey area, but ultimately we're heading to a big cost of living crisis. And one of those, I suppose, the advantages being the opposition, you don't have to have solutions. People will ask you for them, but you are in a position where you can point at problems. But I do think that without a new supply of oil and more oil entering the market for the UK, it's really hard to see how you're going to get around what's going to be a very painful cost of living crisis. Even with this, the expectation in the Treasury is that the cost of living will still be bad. It's just a case of damage limitation in terms of how bad. So I think that Labour's position is something you would expect will please the membership, but it's actually a bit tricky when it comes to how they would really cope with this, because ultimately being in government means, particularly on oil, talking about Iran, Iran doesn't have a great human rights record. It means dealing with lots of countries which aren't the people perhaps you would choose to make your number one ally in other circumstances.
I was just going to comment, quickly. that it would be a mistake to assume that all of these price increases are a result of what's going on in the Ukraine. There has been a war on hydrocarbons brought forth by environmental activists. And this is part of the price of that. Okay, this price increases in oil was going on long before the invasion of Ukraine. And President Biden made a specific plan to basically he wants to end the hydrocarbon industry. He shut down the Keystone Pipeline. He canceled leases. He increased regulations. He did everything that the so-called Greens wanted. And the result is less oil being produced. And oil it's a market and there's supply and demand. But I would argue that even more importantly than his shutting down Keystone Pipeline or other pipelines is the emphasis that all of this is having on banks and on oil companies as BP and Shell decide they're not going to be oil companies anymore because the environmental activists are pressuring their board. So if you're not going to drill for oil, and you don't have a realistic alternative, which you don't at the moment, you're going to see energy prices go up. And I think all the people who were listening to little Greta didn't really think about what it was going to cost them to clap. So they're paying now, and they're going to keep paying until they figure out that right now you need oil, and whether you like it or not. So I think that, to blame this all on Putin and Ukraine is a mistake. We've brought a lot of this to ourselves.
Yeah, very interesting. And James, finally, you mentioned Iran earlier. Obviously, the other big news this week is the return of the British-Iranian aid worker Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe. How does all of that play in the greater context? Is Boris Johnson actually doing better on the foreign policy side? Is he having a few wins at the moment?
Well, I mean, the brutal truth is that the UK paid this debt that it owes Iran, and that is why she has been released. I think it also is a sign of improving relations between Iran and the West, that because the talks in Vienna are perceived to be making progress, it is easier for the UK to kind of find workarounds to the sanctions, to release this money and say it's only going to be used for humanitarian purposes. But I think it does reflect a slight warming in relations between Western capitals and Tehran. I think on the oil price, I think it's important to note that the price is down about $40 from its recent peak. And that is because, China is the world's largest importer of crude oil. And, there is a growing expectation in the market that the fact that China is dealing with its worst COVID outbreak since Wuhan in 2020 means that the Chinese economy is going to be interrupted. Chinese demand for oil is going to fall, and so the global price will go down. So I think there is a kind of in terms of the oil price, the situation looks less. I think we are probably moving into an era where oil prices are not going to quite reach the levels that some people thought they were going to reach just a few weeks ago. But I think I think one of the other aspects of this crisis is it is going to revive the debate in the West about energy independence. I think it is going to lead to more nuclear power, more renewables, because I think that this oil diplomacy is making G7 states again reflect on whether this dependence is sensible or not.
Mm-hmm. And you wrote about that China situation and its implications in your political column for The Spectator this week, so viewers can read that as well. David Rundell, James Forsyth and Katy, thank you for joining Spectator TV. Positive noises are coming out of the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, with even an advisor to President Zelensky of Ukraine showing some optimism. What could that endpoint look like, and what more can the West do to strengthen Ukraine in the meantime? In this week's magazine, the historian Timothy Garton Ash makes 3 suggestions. He joins the show now. So, Timothy, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. In the magazine this week, you write about what the West can do to help Ukraine, and you outline these 3 options. Can you give us a brief overview of them?
Absolutely. I mean, the question of questions, we've seen this heroic, extraordinary Ukrainian resistance. How can we help them? 3 big things, all of which come from President Zelensky in his tweets. Number 1, more weapons, particularly air defense weapons, and supplies to help them resist a siege, because that's what's now happening, an almost medieval siege of Ukrainian cities. Secondly, more sanctions, and the big one here is oil and gas. At the moment, Germans and Italians and others in the EU are still paying billions of euros effectively into Putin's war chest to pay their heating bills. And that would be a really major move, which would cost countries like Germany very dear economically. But as I argue, there's a moral cost to not doing it, right? And then the third big one, which Zelensky asks for, is accept Ukraine as a candidate for EU membership. And there I argue that the EU is not going to do that anytime soon. But there are lots of big things we, including Britain, can do to have a big reconstruction plan and to bring Ukraine gradually closer to a European future.
Can I pick you up on sanctions, first of all, which is that you say that is going to be expensive for the Germans. I think, yeah, it definitely will be. Do you think they're not going far enough now then? Because they have already said that they have already sanctioned some of these Russian companies, not to the extent that they're not importing the resources, but also that they've said that they'll reduce Russian gas by 2/3 by the end of the year. Is that not enough?
How many Ukrainians would have died by the end of the year? I think that's the answer to the question. Listen, because of the big mistakes we all made in not reducing energy dependence after the seizure of Crimea in 2014, they're in a bind, make no mistake. 30% of Germany's total primary energy supply comes from Russian oil, gas, and coal. It's enormous. If they make the stop, the estimated hit is between 1% and 3% of GDP, or 1,000 euros a head. So it's a big economic cost. But as I say, are you really going to go on paying Putin with every heating bill when Ukrainians are being massacred in the way they are?
But what is the realistic middle point? Because you can't just wean off overnight. So is it realistic for Germans or any Europeans to do that?
So interestingly, the big profit maker for Russia is oil. So one way to do this is actually to start by stopping oil imports and take a bit more time over gas. The good news is we're coming into the summer. You don't need so much energy in the summer. But you know what? The popular outrage in Germany is so immense, as it is in Britain, that I think this may yet happen.
And Timothy, on the military front, NATO has ruled out this no-fly zone, as Zelensky is asking for, citing concerns that Putin would use this as justification to attack NATO. But some people have argued that Putin clearly needs no justification for aggression, so it doesn't really matter almost. And if Zelensky's asking for it, maybe we should have that. What do you make of that argument?
Well, what I say is NATO is not going to do it. That's what's clear. And I mean, they've been already, Joe Biden has been absolutely clear about it. Jens Stoltenberg has been absolutely clear about it. So we could have a hypothetical discussion about what would happen if, and the answer is, Putin is capable of anything, but realistically, it's not going to happen. And so we have to do everything short of that mark. And actually, what I gather from the experts is that if we can get in sophisticated anti-aircraft air defense missiles, that's in a way as important as getting in those, Polish MiG planes, or a no-fly zone, which would be a no-fly zone only against the Russians.
And I want to talk to you about this Zelensky plan you're writing about. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, I'm fed up with people keeping saying, we must have a new Marshall Plan, because, there've been I can personally remember about 7 proposed Marshall Plans that never happened for former Yugoslavia, you name it, for East Central Europe. So I call it the Zelensky Plan. But listen, the war damage is already estimated at well over $100 billion. That's clearly an underestimated. The Russians are still pounding away. So it's hundreds of billions. And the least we in the West can do is to have a big reconstruction plan. And my argument is, by the way, that's also rebuilding the homes to which the millions of refugees in the rest of Europe will go home. So that's important for us too. But my argument is to connect it to some intermediate steps of connecting Ukraine more closely to Europe.
Well, it's a fascinating idea, and it's the sweetener, I guess, to those concessions that you alluded to. Can we talk about how this will end? Because it does seem like Zelensky may have to make some of these painful concessions.
So, as I say in the piece, I pray daily for a miracle on the Dnieper, like the miracle on the Vistula in 1920, when the Poles defeated the advancing Red Army and the Red Army simply retreated. But that would be a miracle. And barring miracles, neither side can win. And therefore they're going to have to fight their way, I'm afraid, through rivers of blood, sweat and tears, to a point where there's what Lawrence Friedman, the strategic thinker, calls a hurting stalemate, when both sides are hurting so much that they have to make a deal. And only the Ukrainians have the right to say what that deal is, can be. But we can at least start thinking about it. Now, Zelensky, yesterday, Tuesday, we're speaking on Wednesday, said, I don't think we're going to become a member of NATO. So he's already in effect saying, okay, we can go to neutrality. What's really painful is going to be the territorial concessions, Crimea and Donetsk and Luhansk, the provinces in the far east of the country. And that's really tough to take.
Well, I mean, let alone Zelensky, do you think the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian people would accept something like that?
So I talk regularly to people connected with the Ukrainian government. At the moment, the public position is no. But, and of course, we should in no way, shape or form be kind of forcing this on them, that we have absolutely no right to do that. But privately, they will acknowledge, these are facts on the ground. The comparison I draw with the so-called Winter War between Finland and the Soviet Union in 1939 to 1940, Stalin thought he'd roll over Finland as Putin thought he'd roll over Ukraine. In fact, the Finns put up the most magnificent, amazing military resistance, gave Stalin a bloody nose, and basically 6 months later they signed a peace. They had to give up about 1/10 of Finnish territory. Brutal concession. But Finland remained a free, sovereign, independent, democratic country. And I think every Finn you speak to would say that was a price worth paying.
Mm-hmm. And finally, Timothy, I just want to end on this note that you make about Zelensky. Obviously, his performance, I think, throughout all of this, I think many people can agree, has been exceeded expectations of an actor or comedian. You also mentioned his Twitter feed is a masterclass in 21st century war leadership. Well, tell us about that.
So every viewer should follow him on Twitter. It's absolutely amazing. By the way, when I started, he was just over 2 million followers. Now he's well over 5 million. In the middle of this war, in risk of his life, after every conversation with a Western leader, Biden or Scholz or Macron or Boris Johnson or whoever it is, he just does a tweet saying what they talked about and doing his main points. Then he does these video clips walking around besieged Kiev, his messages to the Ukrainian people and the Russian people. It is an absolute masterclass in political communication. And the effect is, the Ukrainians have already won the information war. The Russians are still fighting the military war, but the information war they've just won hands down. So it's like, imagine Winston Churchill with a Twitter account.
That's a great note to end on. Timothy Garton Ash, thank you very much for joining Spectator TV. Now, the war in Ukraine is obviously an incredibly significant development with deep domestic repercussions around Western countries. But Kate Andrews has noticed that this has provided politicians with something of a cop-out, as they try to blame some of their outcomes of their own policies on Russia instead. Here's Joe Biden from last week talking about record high inflation in America.
Make no mistake, inflation is largely the fault of Putin. I love, the Republicans saying it's Biden's gas pipeline. So I'm sick of this stuff. We have to talk about it because the American people think the reason for inflation is government spending more money. Simply not true.
Kate joins Spectator TV now. Kate, we're hearing a lot about how the Russian invasion means that we're going to be facing a higher cost of living. But you write in this week's magazine that actually that's not to blame for all of the rises in the cost of living, and we shouldn't let the government off the hook there. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so Boris Johnson this week penned an article for The Telegraph where he talked about how weaning Europe off of Russia's gas and energy was going to be a painful transition, but one that we needed to take. And on many accounts, that's completely true, especially if you're looking at countries like Germany, where in December 2021, it was estimated that 32% of their gas imports were from Russia alone. That's going to be a very painful process. Here in the UK, it's roughly 3%. Far less painful to wean ourselves off, but of course, as there's more competition for energy from other countries that aren't buying from Russia, that means our prices go up too. So these are all very legitimate points. But it also means that the Prime Minister has decided to start talking about the cost of living crisis and preparing the public for the cost of living crisis, all within the context of what's happening in Ukraine. And no doubt it's going to be connected, no doubt it's going to make the situation worse. But if we look at things like energy, inflation, and certainly tax hikes, the trajectory of all of them was going up and up and up long before we brought in economic sanctions, and certainly long before Putin put his army's boots across the border in Ukraine. So it is a bit disingenuous, let's say, to suggest that this is all about Ukraine, but I think there's increasing indication that that's how the government is going to try to frame it.
And it's not just the British government, because you point out that Biden is doing a very similar act right now.
Yes, so Joe Biden's actually been leading the way on this, and Americans aren't buying it. He talks a lot about Putin's price hike. That's the phrase he uses. Just recently, he said to House Democrats that the inflation that America has been experiencing was Putin's inflation. Now look, America's inflation headline rate hit a 40-year high. It's well over 7% now, months before we get to Russia's illegal invasion into Ukraine. So again, it's not to say that that's not going to have an impact. It's certainly going to make things worse. And if we look at, say, the price of a barrel of oil, I think you can much more directly connect that to what Russia has done to Ukraine and the economic sanctions that we've taken against them. The US and the UK is following in banning Russian oil completely and the import of it. So, that's a good example where you can draw that direct comparison. But for Biden to suggest that Putin is directly responsible for essentially all American inflation, when he has been printing, borrowing, and spending trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars more over the course of the pandemic, it doesn't quite fly. I mean, people understand that the monetary decision-making around COVID-19 and the implication of that has been hugely inflationary, to the point where the March 2021 budget that Rishi Sunak was putting together here in the UK was designed to try to make the UK as Biden-proof as possible against the possibility of rising inflation because of all the borrowing and spending that he was doing. So, inflation has been on the cards for a really, really long time. And another point to make here is, it's always been really difficult to disentangle the impact of, say, Brexit and COVID on things like the labor market. It is also going to be hard to disentangle the impact of this war that Russia has launched against Ukraine and the impact of 2 years of crazy economic policy, of governments shutting down their economies and kickstarting them again. It's going to be hard to completely separate that, but it is simply not the case to say we are only dealing with these price hikes now because we've decided to take action against Russia. We were going to be dealing with a cost of living crisis if none of this had ever happened.
Yeah, and I remember, Kate, that this time last year and even earlier you were writing about the inflation that's going to come after COVID is done, and we are seeing exactly that now. So it's not just Rishi Sunak, but not to suck up to you too much, but you've been writing about it yourself for months.
Well, there was indication around this time last year when we were leading up to that March budget, and it wasn't just coming from inside Whitehall, it was also coming from economists like Larry Summers over in the States, who is not traditionally hawkish when it comes to inflation, who was saying, look, this is unprecedented what you're doing, shutting down economies, pumping this much new money into the real economy, actually putting it in people's pockets. Deflationary pressures of the past, China coming online, the influx of labor that's been cut off in many ways by Brexit, these things are not going to keep inflation down, and we should be preparing for higher inflation. And nobody was taking these minority voices very seriously, so I was just simply writing about them, I found it interesting. And you also had, at the time, the former chief economist of the Bank of England, Andy Haldane, saying, look, no one knows what's going to happen, but the risk is to the upside. And those minority voices completely turned out to be right. As it turned out, the economic rules that we've always known that we thought perhaps were coming to an end, this idea that inflation and interest rates would just stay at rock bottom no matter what we did when it comes to monetary policy, turned out not to be true. The old rules reared their ugly head, so to speak, and we're dealing with the impact now. Another good example of this is energy prices here in the UK. Rishi Sunak was putting together in early February this year, again before Russia invades, before sanctions, a £9 billion package to help people with their energy bills this year, because Ofgem has lifted the energy price cap by 54%. Because energy is becoming so much more costly. There's just example after example of how the cost of living was going up before Russia's war. I really don't want to say that, Russia is having zero impact here. Obviously now energy bills are going to go up even higher, and that will be directly linked to what we've had to do to stand in solidarity with Ukraine, and what we've rightly done to try to put pressure on Russia to back down. But a lot of Western politicians, Joe Biden, I think increasingly you see Boris Johnson here, hinting at the idea that, what we're about to experience, this pain, this economic pain that we're going to experience here in the West, is because of Putin, partially, but it's also because of a lot of decision making from these governments right here at home over the past 2 years.
Right, because it's not just energy prices, which arguably the governments on either side can't really control if it's a global phenomenon, but things like the national insurance rise, which you write about, which is absolutely a government decision.
Cindy, you're completely right that governments cannot dictate the market price of energy, nor should they really try to do that. But of course, there are government policies that can make the situation better or worse, and the energy price cap here in the UK has put dozens of energy companies out of business. So, we have seen where perhaps the government could have done better on energy policy and has failed to do so. Taxes are a really good point, though. I mean, this is wholly in the government's control. And we have that national insurance hike coming in next month, 2.5 percentage point increase split between employers and employees. And this was sold on the idea that it's going to help with NHS wait lists and wait times post-pandemic. It looks like we're not going to get great results for that money, but the real aim of that money is not pandemic related at all. It's to pay for Boris Johnson's social care plans, which aren't really plans. It's going to subsidize the wealthy. It's going to protect their assets so they don't have to pay for their care if they were to fall ill in old age. No guarantee it's even going to add a single bed to the care home crisis. But the key here is that was also ushered in with the idea of an emergency. The Tories breaking that tax manifesto pledge not to raise national insurance was broken because there was a crisis, and they ushered in this other kind of policy. And you can see something a little bit similar with the narrative happening now. Boris Johnson saying, look, this next phase of economic pain is going to be because of what's happening in Ukraine. Well, yes, partially, but also because of other decision making, including that tax hike. In the piece, I had a Tory MP say to me, and I'm sort of paraphrasing this now, that the narrative has fundamentally shifted. Not only is Partygate out of the news because of the war, but also there is this new thing to pin everything on. Any kind of pain that we experience, we can now pin to Russia's actions, even if that isn't the full answer.
Yeah, that's definitely an effective narrative. Do you think people either in the UK or the US are buying it?
In the UK, I think less so, but they're also ahead in that headline inflation rate. I mean, they're experiencing these price hikes more acutely. The UK isn't all that far behind. So I think that will get more judgmental here, that will get worse here. But in America, the right had already taken to calling it Biden's inflation. And I think that is part of the reason that President Biden is now trying to frame it as Putin's inflation. So you have already a narrative debacle going on there about pointing fingers, who's responsible for what. Look, anybody paying their bills this winter, anybody who's even been buying basic goods knows that prices are going up. They've already been feeling that cost of living squeeze before this war broke out. So I think that, generally speaking, in their gut, the public will know that this is a combination of crises, of things that have gone badly wrong. And you can argue that, as you were saying, Cindy, about energy prices, that's not in the government's control. Many will argue that, lockdowns certainly at certain points throughout the crisis were necessary. There was always going to be economic pain that came out of this. I guess the real question is, did the government honestly prepare the public that the decisions that we made in lockdown to pay people's salaries, to pay people to stay in hibernation, to keep us locked down for as long as they did, months on end sometimes, that was going to have real consequences for years down the line? And are they being transparent now? You know, Rishi Sunak's mini budget, his spring statement is next week, and it will be interesting to see how all of this is framed. He was one of the few voices last year who was warning about inflation. You know, he knows full well that the risks that were associated with all of this long before Putin launched his war. So how will he be framing this? What will that conversation be like with the public? Because we can only pray that things come to a halt and Putin turns his armies back ASAP. But let's say, hypothetically speaking, that happens, that even some sanctions are dropped. The public needs to be aware that that cost of living crisis doesn't completely go away with some kind of victory in Ukraine.
Yeah, that's very true. And speaking of that spring statement then, Kate, what can we expect from Rishi Sunak?
I would be surprised if you didn't see a nod to the cost of living crisis. You know, if he didn't address that in some way, perhaps with some small giveaway or some small tax break. But I wouldn't expect to see a major response to the possibility of energy price hikes in the autumn, because the next time that the energy price cap is set and raised will be around October. And at the moment, the estimates range. It could be £500 it goes up by, it could be £2,000 it goes up by. For understandable reasons, the Treasury is not going to want to commit to a subsidy policy or a handout without actually knowing what those figures are. So I would expect that to be shelved for a little while. And I would expect to see something relatively conservative, because that fiscal headroom that Sunak has been building in, that we know he's desperate to use for tax cuts, is being eaten away by inflation, servicing the debt. Those payments are going up by billions and billions of pounds month on month as inflation rises, as he was warning could happen. And he knows that he's going to have to prepare probably to help people with their energy bills a bit more later in the year. So you might get something in reference to the cost of living crisis, but it is a mini budget, and I expect to see a relatively conservative chancellor taking conservative action.
And I guess now is a great opportunity to plug our live Coffee House Shots event next Wednesday in the Emmanuel Centre at Westminster. So a real physical event where you'll be able to see Kate chatting with Fraser Nelson, Katy and James Forsyth to give you their reaction to that mini budget, so that you can get tickets on the link on the screen right now. Kate, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. And finally, the royal biographer Robert Hardman joins the show. In this week's issue, he writes about the blood ties between the Romanovs, Russia's last royal family, and the British monarchy. So, Robert Hardman, welcome to Spectator TV. First, can you start by telling us about this complicated family tree between the British royal family and the Romanovs?
Well, Queen Victoria was always described as the grandmother, or indeed the great-grandmother of Europe, because everyone pretty much is sort of interrelated via her. And down through her came Prince Philip's great aunt, who married the last Tsar of Russia. Down through her, I might add, came obviously Queen Elizabeth II, but also came Prince Philip and the Queen, both great-grandchildren of Queen Victoria. But also, off one side of the family tree is Prince Philip's grandmother, and her sister married Nicholas II. And so he was really quite closely connected. I mean, so closely, as I've said in the article, that he was asked if he wouldn't mind providing a DNA sample back in the early 90s. For many years, people have been looking for the bones of the Romanovs. And there was an academic who was pretty sure he knew where they were, but he deliberately left them untouched until communism fell. He distrusted the regime. He didn't think they would be safe in communist hands. But once Russia opened up, these bones appeared, and they needed to be authenticated. And Prince Philip did that.
That's amazing. And also, after the Bolshevik Revolution, Prince Philip seems to have grown up around people who used to be, the ruling class in Russia.
Well, exactly. I mean, the Russian Revolution, he was born in 1921. So, I mean, this was sort of live stuff. And the family, while he was a baby, had to get out of Greece very quickly. His father was charged with trumped-up charges by a military court, and it was really thanks to the intervention of King George V and British diplomats in Athens that they got the family out. His father was the younger son of the king, but he was in the army. He was blamed for this catastrophic defeat against the Turks, and they needed a scapegoat. It was going to be him. However, a British destroyer turned up in Athens, managed to get the family out just in time. Prince Philip was a baby and famously was carried aboard this British warship in an orange box, and they went into exile. They went into exile in Paris. And at the time, you had all these remnants of sort of Russian nobility, Russian royalty, slowly escaping the clutches of the Bolsheviks. And a lot of them ended up in Paris, and a lot of them would sort of meet up and see a lot of each other because they didn't have much else to do.
Talk about the good old days.
Yeah, exactly. Talk about, exactly. The sort of, and back in the days of the Tsar. And one of these characters, Grand Duke Dmitry, who was a distant cousin of Prince Philip's, it was obviously a real character. He used to come around to their house quite a bit for sort of tea and tell his stories. And I mean, one of his stories is quite extraordinary. He was one of the men who helped to murder Rasputin. Rasputin
Wow.
was the sort of this bogus shaman figure, this sort of monk-like alleged genius who had a sort of hold over the Tsarina. And a lot of people at court thought he was a wrong 'un and decided he had to go. And he famously, it didn't go easily, but eventually they famously killed him and pushed him under the ice and all the rest of it. And one of those involved, one of the plotters, one of the murderers was cousin Dmitry, but who Prince Philip adored.
Yeah, well, he says that he remembers him fondly.
Yes, I mean he'd have been a sort of schoolboy. He was at primary school at the time. He went, his first school was in Paris, but this larger than life character turns up with all these tales of old Russia, and he was absolutely spellbound. I didn't talk to him about the other side of Grand Duke Dmitry, a bit of a playboy who ended up as a lover of Coco Chanel. I'm not sure that was discussed over the teacups in the suburb of St. Cloud. But these sort of characters loomed large. I mean, it is often said that Prince Philip was more royal than the royals, because he really was connected via this sort of extraordinary dynastic diaspora, and so fast forward to the end of communism, and he was absolutely fascinated. I mean, he had been back because among his many hats he wore, he was president of the International Equestrian Federation for many years. Very, very influential president. I mean, he changed a lot of things. He rewrote the rule books and a lot of sport. But he happened to be president at the time of the Moscow Olympics, so that took him over to Russia, not as a royal, but as a sort of senior sporting administrator. And so on those trips, he would come into contact with the sort of Soviet high command. And of course, the Moscow Olympics became very controversial because in a sort of foretaste of what we're going through today, Russia had just invaded Afghanistan. And a lot of people were boycotting those games. And a lot of people weren't. And he decided just to step back. His particular sport decided to leave it to individuals to decide, but he himself refused to go to the Moscow Olympics. He just thought it would just be too controversial. But so he'd had some experience of Soviet Russia, and also on those sort of periodic moments when Britain would be trying to sort of seek a bit of a thaw in the sort of Cold War foyer. Russian leaders would occasionally come to Britain, and in the mid-50s, he and the Queen entertained Bulganin and Khrushchev, who of course were the sort of two top men in the Kremlin at the time, and they came for drinks at Windsor Castle. They certainly didn't get a sort of state visit, but it was a sort of cordial welcome. And as I say in my piece, Prince Philip told me that he took them into the Queen decided to greet them in the Waterloo Chamber, and in there's this enormous portrait of Tsar Alexander I. And so they showed these two communists. Here is this is the only Russian we've got on the walls. There he is, sort of thing. To which they went, oh yes, he was a great patriot. Oh yes, no, he was a great man in our history. Which they thought was a bit, that's interesting because you're hardcore Bolsheviks and you murdered a lot of them. But I think it just showed that rather, as we see with Putin now, actually, that sort of Russian patriotism sort of trumps class warfare at that end of the Kremlin. And he, as Prince Philip said, so they had this sort of chat, and he said, and then we took them through to the Red Drawing Room, which seemed rather appropriate. So all through the Cold War, and he took this great interest, not just in it for sort of dynastic family reasons, but because he was a very distinguished member of the armed forces until he had to step down, and he always, all through his life, was fascinated by all the forces, and at that time the number one threat to those forces was Russia. So he was very well informed on all aspects of the Cold War.
Yeah, and just talking about the end of the Cold War then, how excited was he? How did he feel when the USSR fell? Because you spoke to him on the eve of this 1994 state visit by the Queen and Prince Philip to Russia. What was he like?
Oh, he really was very excited. I mean, he and the Queen had sort of played a part in making that state visit come about some years before, because when Mikhail Gorbachev was as it were bringing down opening up the gates, however you want to put it, but at that period of what we called perestroika and glasnost, Gorbachev and his wife came to Britain in 1989, and Margaret Thatcher's government were very keen to sort of lay out the red carpet, and that included a trip to Windsor to see the Queen, and they had this lunch at Windsor, and after lunch the Queen sort of laid on a special exhibition of all various bits of sort of Russian memorabilia, to sort of make him feel at home. Things I think a Fabergé egg was retrieved from the royal collection, that sort of thing, and they kind of hit it off. I mean, Gorbachev was genuinely touched to be given this sort of royal treatment, and at the end of that lunch, I mean, I'm sure it had been pre-prepared by the diplomats, but at the end of that lunch, he formally issued an invitation to the Queen to come on this state visit. Then in the meantime, by the time the state visit happened, he'd actually been kicked out, and Boris Yeltsin was in charge. But yes, the Duke was absolutely thrilled to be going on this trip.
Well, and Robert, finally, just part of that trip was organised by a deputy mayor called Vladimir Putin.
Yes, yeah. The person who'd organised the St. Petersburg end of things, there was the mayor of the city, but the person who did all the sort of the groundwork was the deputy mayor, whose name was Vladimir Putin. And I did ask the Sir Robert, I said, what do you remember of Putin? He said, well, he didn't say very much. Classic kind of ex-KGB colonel, ostensibly organising a royal visit, but probably working out where to plant the bugs. But it has to be said. I mean, in an act, it was a remarkable bit of soft power, actually. That the quayside where Britannia was birthed, which was where the original Russian warship, the Aurora, fired the first shots of the revolution, always used to be known as the English Embankment, and in honour of the Queen and Britannia, they put the name back to it. It had a Soviet name in the meantime. They renamed it the English Embankment. Whether they're still going to call it that now, I've no idea. It'd probably be called the Putin Embankment by now. But it was looking back on it, it was an extraordinary few years. There was a real sense that this dark period was over, and here was this great
real optimism.
Yeah, that this part of the world was going to come around to a Western way of thinking. I mean, I don't think anyone expected them to be sort of rushing to join the EU or suddenly adopt European ways instantly. But there was clearly a sense that now is the time to reach out. And it was an interesting visit because I spoke to the British ambassador out there, Sir Brian Fall, very distinguished British diplomat, who he was obviously very keen for this visit to happen, but there were a lot of cautious voices in the Foreign Office saying, "Oh, it's a bit soon. Oh, not sure. Don't think we want to. Oh, let's wait." Classic sort of Whitehall dithering. It was, Sir Brian was saying, no, come on, we got to go now because this is the moment. The whole place is in chaos, and Yeltsin needs the sort of imprimatur, if you like, of a visit from somebody like the Queen. There aren't many people who can really, stop the traffic, but she's one. And she was very keen to go. She'd always wanted to go, and she had this invitation from Gorbachev, and off she went. And it was just one of those visits that you look back on and think, well, that was extraordinary. It was the first, and sadly, the first and only state visit. Putin came on a return visit some years later, 9 years later. He was welcomed to London and given the full treatment, taken up the Mall in a carriage procession and given the state banquet. Didn't really look as though he was enjoying it terribly much, just sort of going through the motions. And then very soon afterwards, Russia started to sort of retreat into itself. But for that sort of 10, 15-year period, there was a sense that the entire world order was changing. And there in the vanguard of that sort of transformation was the Queen and Prince Philip.
A different time. Robert Hardman, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV.
Thank you.
That's it for this week. Once again, we're delighted that Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management is sponsoring the week in 60 minutes. Canaccord will provide the expertise you need to build your wealth with confidence. You can visit candowealth.com to find out more. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to the Spectator's YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching, and do join us again next week.